So, Simon, welcome back to part two of our conversation. We left off last week with, we'd been talking about an innate relationship that you had with the landscape and how that you were having to explore why the images that we're making with a fairly high degree of intuition and just instinct, why some of them were successful, why some of them were less successful, perhaps. So how did you rationalize this? Where did your kind of self-analysis get you?
I think the first turning point was when I had my very first solo trip to Glencoe. So that was this is in 2015, November 2015, and that's the first time that I've been away and had a dedicated photography trip. And all I was set on was creating an image which I felt was kind of my take on the area. So I went to kind of honeypots and things like that just to experience them and see them, but I didn't feel as if I was being fulfilled by them. So I wanted to get something that felt a bit more me. So I remember being near the Three Sisters one afternoon and it was belting it down with rain. I was stood under an umbrella and I just worked the space for about 2 hours, just making small movements, fine tuning the composition, and trying to connect the experience and the mood of what was in front of me and try and reflect that in the composition in terms of focal length, where I stood, what I included, what I excluded. And it resulted in an image which was easily the best composition that I'd made up to that point. But the thing was that I started to understand why it worked and how the positioning of things was having an impact on the emotion in the scene. And it kind of heightened my appreciation for different forms of light as well, because it was just raining and quite dull weather, but the effect on the light was quite nice. So that was kind of the first turning point. But I would say that perhaps the biggest turning point was when I realized how important emotion is in photography. And it wasn't something that I was consciously aware of, but that image that I mentioned before that Joe Cornish was complimentary about. I was at that scene one morning and I was in a bit more of a fragile state. I was experiencing quite a lot of pain, etc. And I was looking at this scene and then I realized that a lot of the images that I was taking were quite reflective of how I was feeling personally. So it was quite somber. It was broken trees, bits hanging off, dead trees within a kind of crumbling landscape in foggy conditions where, the vision forward was obscured. And I got quite upset because I realized just how profoundly important photography was, or certainly the local landscape was to me. And I didn't realize that subconsciously I was creating these images which were reflective of how I was feeling. And I think that was another revelation, in that being consciously aware how important the emotion is just seemed to heighten that emotion more and that passion more, and made me want to achieve even more with what I was doing locally. And I think I just gradually, decisions started to become a little bit more conscious. I think that instinctive side of photography should always be there, but I think my hit rate started to go up because consciously I was making some compositional choices which I felt had an impact on the feeling in the image, not following any rules, but just something that felt complementary to the subjects that I was choosing to photograph.
Right. No, that opens up a massive potential avenue. Yeah, Pandora's box of possible avenues that we can kind of walk down here. I think the one that's kind of, because we don't have an agenda, we don't have a tick list of the 20 questions we've got to get through. We're free to move forward any way we want. And I think the one I'm most interested in there is, if emotional resonance with the landscape, if emotional connectivity with ourselves seem to be the key factors in images that we find creatively and aesthetically pleasing, because it's that seeing ourselves in the landscape, I think, becomes the connection and that feeling of uniqueness. I mean, as you've talked about honeypot locations, it's very difficult to create something that hasn't been seen many times before, whereas in intimate woodlands it's a lot easier to do that to a certain extent. So if intuition is the key driving force to creativity, can it be taught? and what's the easiest way for people to sort of, you know, because we've got to kind of, can we use rules at all to teach intuition?
Yeah, it's an interesting one, this, and it's something, my thoughts on this are constantly shifting, because my gut feeling a few years back would have been, you cannot teach this. You cannot teach somebody to be emotionally connected to the landscape. But I think I'm changing my mind on that now, because I don't think you can necessarily, it's not like you give somebody a tip and they can take that away and immediately use it. It's more about nurturing an instinct. So I've had a client on a few workshops, and if I was to ask him, what have you learned on these workshops? He might not be able to give you a clear answer, but his photography has improved as a result of them.
Right.
And I think that's the nurturing of instinct.
Right.
But I think the emotional connection is something that can be inspired through conversation. And actually, you know, when I've had clients and we've been looking at a particular tree and we've had a conversation about that tree, not necessarily in terms of how, well, definitely not in terms of how to technically execute an image there, but conversations about, why does this tree work? What's interesting about it? How can we create an image here which does the tree justice, is reflective of its unique qualities, etc. And I think the discussions around emotional connection, and if I can explain clearly why I like something and why I want to make an image in a particular way, that they can't then take that away and immediately start and emotionally connect with subjects close to them, but it's more about just changing the way that they think. And I have conversations with people which sometimes get quite emotional for clients, because you're asking them to connect with a side of them that they've maybe buried down a little bit. And then I try to get them to kind of channel that into the images that they're making, and what they see can be very different to what I see. But if I explain what I'm seeing, then that can inspire some thoughts in a direction for them to take.
Right. Well, like you say, it's about opening up a dialogue of alternatives.
Yeah.
And I think this could be the paradigm. And one of the reasons I was so keen to speak with you is that your work is clearly emotional. It's clearly born out of an emotional relationship with the subject that you're photographing. And I use the word subject very, very loosely. I don't believe in subjects particularly. Now, this might be a good way for us to look at this part of our conversation, which is the paradigm necessary for people, because I think most people aspire to improve their photography.
Yeah.
I think most people, when they go out and buy a camera, and the easiest thing to do is to go to famous locations and learn how to process like crazy and make them look incredibly magical and dramatic. And then you just get on that treadmill of competitive photography.
Yeah.
And the other approach is to go into intimate landscapes like you and I do, and engage with emotion and find our emotions in the landscape. Now, I don't believe a set of rules can get you to that point, because all it becomes is a repetitive, you go out into the landscape looking for, this has to be here, that needs to be there needs to be this light, and then I put these things here. So do you think that that form of teaching is in any way beneficial to people to get them on the ladder? Or do you think that you can start with a completely clean canvas and learn to be intuitive and free and emotionally connected without that framework of aesthetic guidelines, templates?
Yeah, I think the guidelines and templates are a hindrance to creativity in woodland. because
particularly in woodlands, yes.
yeah, and I think I've seen people that have no experience in woodland photography, but have lots of experience in the wider landscape, and principles they've been applying in that environment. They try and bring that to the woodland, and they really struggle. And it's because they're trying to force an aesthetic. They're trying to force these ideas onto the landscape, and this kind of false idea, I think, that we can take these rules and apply them to a very complex environment, and that will give us something successful. And it's too hard. You know, you walk into woodland and you have foreground, midground, background, rule of thirds, and a leading line. You'll be there forever. So I think, you know, a more, you know, the approach, I think a clean slate is exactly what is needed. But that's where I think, if you haven't got, I think some people want structure. Some people want to be told what to do. Some people want guidelines, and these are some general ideas that are really going to help you. But I think really it just has to be about going in and finding out what means, you know, what's important to you, because what's a nice woodland photograph to me might be very different to a nice woodland photograph to somebody else. So I think first and foremost, you have to make sure, you know, speaking about woodland, or, you know, you just have to make sure that the place that you go, you just love being there first and foremost. Because if you're trying it for the sake of just creating woodland images because it's quite popular at the minute, then it's kind of pointless. I think you just have to have the genuine connection there, and love and drive to want to do something, but then communicate what it is about that environment that matters to you as an artist.
Right.
And let that help guide the types of images that you want to create. I've always let that guide, you know, my connection to what I'm looking at, let that guide as to where I stand and how I compose it. Like I said before, it's a two-way communication. We can't force our preconceived ideas on the landscape. We have to let the landscape communicate back to us. And you can't have that without that connection, without that empathy and understanding of the subject matter. It shouldn't just be a tree. It should be, well, it's a species of trees, and this is how this species of trees, the species of tree behaves. And I think, and then when you can understand, then you can build upon that and actually care and have, you know, and be empathetic about what you're actually choosing to photograph.
This next question is going to have to come with a health warning for you, because it's going to come so far out of left field. Right. So
you stretch first.
Yeah, have a good time. Let's do some lunges. This question's ideal for you, really, because you're someone who's clearly very connected with your environment and the life forms that live in the environment that you spend your time in. And the question is this: do you feel that the different species of tree that inhabit your areas, so I guess that's going to be oak and alder and birch and perhaps beech and some others, do you feel that each of those different species of tree somehow either represents a different part of your emotional spectrum? Do you find yourself drawn to specific types of trees when you're in specific types of moods, or do you feel that specific types of trees elicit certain moods in your images?
I think probably these days, probably the latter.
Right.
It's a good question, though. It's a good question because I think the understanding of the trees is crucial in, you know, we do like some structure to what we're doing. I think some structure helps because it allows us to make good use of our time. So an understanding of the species of trees would allow me to pick a particular woodland at a certain time of year.
Of course.
So I think if I go into an oak woodland in the wintertime and it's, you know, murky and very cold and just a very kind of moody, somber environment, then yeah, I think that is going to inspire me to create images that portray that feeling. But stick me in a birch woodland in the summertime, then all of a sudden you start to be inspired to create something a bit more impressionist or
Yeah.
painterly, because it's just naturally like that. And I think it's often a question that I receive is, how do you make your images look so painterly? And I think it's this idea that it's all done in post-processing, whereas a lot of it is, well, it's painterly because it's naturally does have a painterly quality about it.
That's right.
The soft
Yeah.
light and the species of tree. So yeah, I think before I was drawn more towards certain types of trees and scenes based on my emotion. Whereas now I think my emotion is a little bit more settled. So I think it's probably the latter.
Good. Well, and so much of this mirrors my own thoughts, because I was out today and we're surrounded by a mixture of larch and Scots pine, birch, oak, lots of oak trees up here. But the oak trees up here are very, very different from where you are, because we're almost in like a North Atlantic maritime rainforest.
Sessile oaks.
Yeah, well, sessile oak, and also they're all covered in moss. Because it's almost like a rainforest climate here, so it's a very different character from the ones that you have down in the north of England down there.
Fairy tale woodlands.
Yes, but not always the happy ending type.
The angry goblins, not the friendly ones.
Yeah. So it can be a pretty aggressive place aesthetically, anyway. I really want to ask you that question because I think it just came to my mind that I feel very different emotions in different types of woodland and under different types of lighting conditions. And it can feel either joyful and inspiring, or it can feel very melancholy and quite intimidating.
I have probably, it might be my most recognizable image, the one that I've used as my kind of logo, the dead oak tree within the plantation. That is scary.
Yeah.
I did a video talking about just that image. But yeah, that's the only place that I go and I genuinely feel nervous. I'm kind of rushing to take the picture.
Yeah.
And then I get out and I think, did I get that right? I shouldn't be rushing the picture. Then I go back. I'm like, oh no, I want to leave again.
I know.
And it is the only place that I go that happens. I took Adele in the middle of the day while the sun was shining, and she didn't like it at all. I said,
wow,
you want to try being here at 5 o'clock in the morning when it's foggy?
Yeah. Well, you need to go in there and do it by full moon one night.
Yeah.
See if you can last the night.
Yeah.
Well, I think this is fascinating though, because the aesthetic of the photograph is telling that emotional story, even without words. And I think this is one of the real standout things about your photography is that there's a consequence to the arrangement of the elements, and there's a consequence emotionally to the color palette that you're using, and then the relationship between detail and atmosphere. So someone at our back door. So that the almost like a summary of your feeling of what creativity is, or do you have another definition?
Creative now, well, I think fundamentally creativity is it's an expression of what we care about. If we're talking about the landscape, I think it's fundamentally an expression of what we care about in the natural world, and how we see the world. And I think for me, also, I've talked about something called the creative thread before.
Okay.
And this is something that's important to me. So in terms of how I define being fulfilled in creativity, I feel as if it should have a number of things. And it's not like, it's not like a formula that I have to stick to, but I love the idea of everything starting with creativity as starting as soon as I've left the house.
Okay.
So it might start with actually the music that I listen to while I'm driving to a location, and that might start to set a mood. And then I'm thinking about the location that I'm going to, and I've got ideas in my head. quite often that changes when you get there, and it just goes with the flow and you go with the conditions and whatever you're presented with. But then to kind of leave the home, find a woodland, discover somewhere for the first time, invest weeks, months, or even years getting to know that place intimately, finding compositions, finding trees that I just absolutely love, and maybe seeing it in conditions which aren't, conducive to creating a version which I think does it justice. But just seeing that and recognizing the potential, and then working towards making that image work, making that image, bringing it home, just that gut feeling that it's worked, and then printing that image and then hanging it on the wall. So I've gone through that whole process of creativity from start to finish. That's what it's all about for me. And that's when I feel like 100% fulfilled, much more fulfilled than if I just turned up at a place that had been photographed, a million times before. Because it feels like it's personal, feels like it's a true reflection of something that I've genuinely connected with. I've found it and I've worked it, and it's just turned into something that you're proud of.
Right. Yes, I mean, I agree with a huge amount of that. I think because I'm a very spontaneous creator. I tend to produce my best work very spontaneously. It's more of a recognition of something, so it's much more a moment by moment basis type thing.
Yeah.
Where creativity is a spontaneous thing. So I don't plan particularly, and even though I do go back to areas a lot, locally, of course,
Yeah.
I rarely make my best photographs when I go to somewhere specifically to try and do something with that thing.
Yeah, and I think
I find on the way that turns out to be better.
Yeah, you get both. I mean, I've got some images which are very much in the moment, very opportunistic, and I still feel fantastic about those. But I would say my most accomplished work has been something that I've worked towards locally. So such as that spooky tree, such as the dysfunctional family, a fairly recent one which I quite like that I printed quite large called Lothlorien.
Yep.
Yeah, and I just it just I don't know. I guess it's just a feel good factor, but then equally ones that I've created in Torridon that I've just found in the moment. And I think it's a very different kind of thing. You've got one where you've been on a journey, and you've got one where it has this huge amount of excitement in a very short space of time.
Right.
So you've gone out, you've been fortunate with the conditions, you've seen something, you've taken a photograph, and it's just worked out, and it's just this kind of whirlwind of excitement, and that's fantastic as well.
Would you say that you're evolving as an emotional person the longer you're involved in photography? Do you think that your photography and the craft and the expression and the diversity of expression that you're capable of now articulating with your work, because we've talked about different trees having different personalities and feelings and emotions associated with them. Scots pines are very different from birch.
Yeah.
Do you think that you're finding that you're recognizing a broader set of nuances in yourself than perhaps you might have had 6 or 7 years ago before you got into this?
I have actually, and that's being, we sometimes talk about the downsides of social media, but to put a positive spin, actually being on YouTube, despite the kind of pressures of it, sometimes it forces it. Well, the way that I approach it has encouraged me to be much more introspective, because I need to articulate some of the things that I'm doing, the things that I'm talking about, and the reasons why I'm doing certain things. So because I've, as part of articulating that, I've needed to understand it myself. So I've been thinking a lot more about my practice as a photographer. And it's amazing what comes to the surface, and just through conversations as well. I did a podcast for somebody about 3 years ago, and then just through the conversation, it just suddenly dawned on me all the parallels that how I approach photography, the parallels that has with the hobbies that I've had in the past. And then you start to understand your own personality a bit more, because you understand that actually I'm not actually that different to what I was 20, 30 years ago.
Mm.
There's a lot of parallels with that, but it's just, like I said, it's being more consciously aware. And I think when you're more consciously aware of some of these emotional nuances, like you said, in yourself, it does change things. And I think part of that has been running workshops as well.
Mm.
I've learned to be a much less judgmental person because of experiences that I've had with clients. Dare I say that someone they at first might have come across as difficult to get on with, but they're actually just fantastic people when you
Mm.
get to know them. And so that's been really interesting as well, and has helped to make me more rounded. I'd like to think.
Well, surely that's part of the game, isn't it? Is to become. I've always considered it to try and be the best version of myself that I can be.
Yeah.
And that comes with being non-judgmental. I find that reducing expectations of the landscape and my performance in the landscape is a very healthy approach as well.
Yeah.
The last question I'm going to ask you for part two here is: are you a happy photographer?
um, most of the time, yes. Most of the time, yes. I'm somebody who doesn't cope well with stagnation. So if I feel as if things aren't moving forward, even if the trend is just very, very slowly upwards, that's kind of fine. But if I feel as if I'm just on a flat line or going down, then yeah, I don't cope very well with that. So it's like if you go through a phase where you're really wanting to achieve some sort of things locally, but everything just feels as if it's against you and you're fighting for creativity,
Mm.
then that kind of can get me down a little bit. Or if I impose too much pressure on myself, that can be
Right.
difficult. Or if I'm thinking too much about how YouTube has become quite competitive, I just sort of need to distance myself from that. And then when it's just me, Meg, and the woods and my camera, that's when I feel happy again.
Okay. Good. Well, I think that's a perfect place to end part two. Thank you very much again for that.
Thank you.
And I look forward to part three.